Welcome everyone to this month's installment of the ReproNim webinar series. I apologize for my background noise. So today we have Satra talking about Repro schemas. And just to foreshadow, our next meeting will be September 4th. Jeff and the TR&D1 team will be talking about the Repro Lake, the ReproNim publicly accessible metadata store. So without further ado, I'll actually let Satra introduce himself and get started.
Hi, folks. My name is Satra Ghosh. I'm a member of the ReproNim team, and I direct TR&D2, whose job is to describe things around neuroimaging. I work at MIT, and my group does work on trying to understand the neurobiology of human communication on one hand, do some machine learning towards precision medicine and psychiatry, and then a whole lot of scientific plumbing to make our research lives easier. And ReproSchema is one of those scientific plumbing efforts to try and improve some pieces of our scientific research life. But before I get started with ReproSchema, I've been told I have a significant responsibility in announcing the ABCD ReproNim course for those of you who haven't yet seen the various Twitter and social media shares on this. The course is designed to provide a comprehensive background to the data from the ABCD study while delivering hands-on interactive instruction to enable rigorous and reproducible data analysis. The actual course will start October 16th, but at this point, we are accepting applications for both TA slots as well as enrolled students. However, observer students will be able to continue to enroll past these deadlines. So these specific deadlines are very much geared towards people who will actively participate and receive support from the course. With that, I'm sure there are various places where you can go look at this. The ABCD ReproNim.org website is online, and you can go click on it and see all the details of the study. Now moving on. So first, a huge thank you. Don't know where things will end up today, but I just wanted to make sure that all the people who have been involved with various aspects of this project were acknowledged. The giant share of work on this project has been done by Sanu, who's in the ReproNim team for TR&D2 at MIT, but various other people have played a significant role in improving various components, including discussions that have helped improve the whole effort itself. So I'll highlight a few folks from this list. Anisha was one of the first ones to get us started when she was a postdoc over at UW on the UI that we will share with you and show you. Remy has been fantastic in kind of taking some of the things that we built and applying it to a slightly different problem and forcing us to rethink some of the things that we've been doing. Zalika helped us do a similar thing from the perspective of Loris, kind of making us think through the schema so that certain aspects of how they do things in Loris could be handled. Hauka has been interacting with us while he was with ABCD, and I think he's still tangentially linked to ABCD to try and get various ABCD study questionnaires into the schema. And then Arno and his team at the Child Mind Institute have been developing MindLogger, which I'll briefly mention later on. And they have been using ReproSchema as part of their work and have been helping us kind of rethink and retune pieces of ReproSchema itself. We are very glad to have been supported by funding from NIH. Various conversations that are ongoing for a long time with the neuroimaging data sharing working group of the INCF, and finally members of the ReproNim group itself. We've had several conversations that have guided and tuned many of the things I'm about to present to you. So let's start with a very brief intro to what is the ReproSchema. It is a ReproNim project, and it was intended to solve a set of problems associated with clinical and behavioral data collection. It was hoped that we could use this to relate data across studies and projects in one or more laboratories. And finally, to create an open and reusable library of clinical and behavioral assessments. So that was kind of the overarching notion. What I'm going to do is kind of walk through the history of this project a little bit, but specifically focusing on some of the challenges that come about. So most of you are going to be familiar with the next few things that I'm going to talk about. First, there are lots of assessments out there. There could be various specific tests for psychiatric disorders. You could have them as paper and pencil tests like the MOCA. You could have a structured clinical diagnostic interview. But we do this kind of assessments or data collection in all aspects of neuroimaging research. And some of these tests are public and some of them are proprietary. And we've used these assessments to study and probe various aspects of cognition in health and disease. So there's a collection of tests, and most people who are domain experts know what collection of tests to use. Then comes the matter of collection. And one of the approaches that has come about recently is something called MindLogger from our collaborative partners at the Child Mind Institute. But there are other very well-known data collection instruments out there, such as REDCap and the NIH Toolbox. Now, many people don't use any of these and may end up using something like Google Forms, a paper and pencil test, Excel spreadsheets, and other things to collect data. And up to this point, a lot of things are done in lab, and you're collecting data for a specific experiment, a specific type of assessment that you've used routinely for your experiments. So often things get to be very geared towards in-lab practices at this point. But with various data sharing and data archiving efforts that have come online, in many cases, you're expected to submit data to these public data archives. It might be the NIMH data archive or the NDA. It might be to one of the other brain initiative archives like OpenNeuro or Dandy or NEMO or Brain Image Library. And one of the things that comes up is that across all of these archives, there's a lot of human data being submitted, which means there's a lot of assessments, clinical, behavioral, and otherwise, that are collected alongside that data, which enrich the data and often are related to the kind of neuroimaging data that one is collecting or the genetic information that one is collecting. And therefore, it becomes essential to submit these other phenotypic assessments alongside the experimental data that's typically collected. And at this point in time, people put in the effort to kind of try and tune what they have collected towards this submission. And this is where we run into the set of challenges that we have seen over the years. So curation is one of the hardest problems because it requires knowledge of assessments, various standards, schemas, technologies, licensing. And whether you're curating it for your own lab or for the world outside your lab, there often is a significant requirement in the level of knowledge that you need to do a good job with curation. Sometimes curation also requires understanding the intent of a protocol or assessment. Why am I measuring something? Why am I asking this question? And that requires additional knowledge that kind of brings to bear how you might relate certain aspects of something that you're curating to other things. Often this curation is done post-acquisition, as I mentioned earlier, and that leads us to all kinds of challenges in terms of how we map what we have represented in our own local databases, Excel files, or other spreadsheets, to the kinds of things that are required by the external world in accepting the data that we have collected. And this is where there is a significant number of standards, formats, and ontologies that come into play. And the other thing is not just the sheer number of these possible ontologies, but the evolution of these ontologies as time progresses, because we are doing science, things change. Which of these ontologies remain stable? Which of these move about? Which standard am I now not adhering to any longer as I do this conversion? And that's still a fairly tall order on most scientists to be able to keep up with this world. Finally, when you want to do a certain assessment, as a domain scientist, you're very aware of the kinds of activities and protocols you may want to use. And it's easy to pull those things. For the arbitrary scientist out there, it's very hard to see this as a consistent effort across different kinds of assessments. There are tools like the Cognitive Atlas, which links to some of these assessments, but the broad range of behavioral and clinical assessments is fairly large. and the links between these assessments and what they address is not often clear. So there needs a place to not only collect these assessments, but also relate them to each other in a consistent manner. The fourth challenge we tend to face is provenance. If you think of an Excel spreadsheet, all you have typically are numbers or values and a set of columns. So this loses a lot of information at that point in time. Those column names carry rich information. We've lost information with respect to the collection instrument that was used, the exact assessment form that was used, and hence we are lacking provenance from this perspective. We are just looking at that spreadsheet of numbers. There's further lack of the linked information that links between the data collection plan. You had said I would collect X, and did you actually collect X? So in many cases, we're just left with the final numbers with some clues as to where things came from, but not the full picture, the full rich picture of details. Scientific domains evolve. That's been the nature of science. We come up with new assessments. We get different kinds of sensors. A variety of different use cases crop up where some of the requirements that we have in collecting data in one use case might overlap with the requirements of collecting data in another use case. So these are some of the common challenges that everybody faces in terms of data collection as they transition from a purely in-lab, in-project exercise to a more public-facing exercise of depositing this data to domain-specific or other data archives. So I'll start with an example. On the left over here, we have a filled-in example of the patient health questionnaire, a particular questionnaire that's used to assess symptoms associated with depression. And as you can see, it has 10 questions listed here. 9 of these are kind of primary questions, and the 10th question is asked if you answer positively to any of the 9 questions. On the right, we see the schema corresponding to the patient health questionnaire in the NIMH data archive. And the number of items in the schema is 43. Well, I think for most of us, we'll say that 10 is not equal to 43. They're both some numbers greater than 2, but they're not the same numbers. Now, some of the items of this schema are very specific to the NDA, and we can understand. They're things like subject key, source subject ID, interview age, date, and sex. They have kind of those common keys across every single assessments they curate. But the rest of the items leaves us a little more puzzled. So let's kind of look at that a little bit. So remember, this questionnaire has 9 questions and a 10th optional question depending on how you answer the 9 questions. So here are 2 segments of those items from the NDA schema. On top, you see a set of data elements corresponding to questions 1 through 10, which is what you would have expected. Then you have a section that looks at a version 8 version of the schema. And then there are a couple of additional options which seem to overlap with other data elements. So there's the PHQ-9 total, the PHQ-10 severity at the end. Now let's move over to the right column a little bit. The description of what's attached to these data elements. So in PHQ-1, it says, little interest or pleasure in doing things. In PHQ-V8_1, which is in the middle of the screen, says, over the past week, how often have you felt little interest or pleasure in doing things? So if I go back to the original schema, you'll notice on the top left where the preamble of this questionnaire says, over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of these following problems? In neither of the item lists do we have the correct information associated with the questionnaire. What's even more weird is that a set of items in this questionnaire are not only duplicates of other data elements, but they also have almost no relation to the questionnaire itself. And it is these kinds of details with respect to standardizing questionnaire that challenges the curation process around it. Now, the reason this happened was that in the early days, different people, different labs would collect these items in different names, data elements, and would submit things that's relevant to the lab, to the experiment they were doing. And they wanted it in one place because it was relevant. But wanting it in one place is one thing from a lab perspective, is another thing from an information perspective. We would want to relate pieces of these things, but saying all of these belong to the patient health questionnaire is perhaps not the right way to go about doing this. So this was how we got started on ReproSchema, in trying to take something like the PHQ-9 schema from the NDA and reverse engineering it to better understand how do we map on to the original questionnaire that it came from. Along the way, so as you start off with building some kind of a standard or a representation, you look into what's out there. What have people done in representing things consistently? And we started with the Cedar template model. It wasn't version 1.5.0 when we started, but it gave us an initial start to the kinds of elements that you might want to represent in a form-based interface for collecting data. Now, Cedar did a bunch of things which we have extended, and we are still looking forward to thinking about how we align the extensions we have made, how do we incorporate them back into the Cedar template model. So some of the things that Cedar did was they had programmatic access to the metadata content in JSON, allowed convertibility of semantically meaningful metadata to RDF, and I'll get into what RDF is later on. And they had validation of the JSON LD instances using their parent schema. So they were providing an interface, which we can see on the right, in kind of creating a form. And one of the things they've added on very recently is where if you use their form, they even have a suggestion option, which will start pulling in items from ontologies to say how you might choose, in this case, let's say, a set of diseases that exist in some ontology. So Cedar has done some fantastic work in improving how information is gathered and represented. But for us, it was a starting point, and we had to go beyond it, and which is what I will talk about a little later. In addition to Cedar, there are other ways in which people have been marking up different terms and properties. So one of them is the schema.org effort, which is a more general purpose effort to create a curated vocabulary of terms that people can reuse in all kinds of structured settings, in particular something like Google search, or to improve search engine optimization over websites that they deliver. Schema.org does not have biomedical specific terminologies. Therefore, to kind of serve that gap, bioschemas came about to extend the work of schema.org to various biomedical domains. So they propose new types and new properties on top of schema.org to describe various life science resources. And this is still ongoing work in progress, and our efforts have been to try and align with both of these efforts to the extent possible, and to understand where we are differing so that we can pitch back to some of these communities, whether it's Cedar, schema.org, or bioschemas, depending on the needs that arise as we represent information for form-based assessments. One of the challenges I listed earlier was the availability of a shared library. So since we started, there have been significant efforts by other groups to create common resources, but there are some drawbacks that come along with these resources. One of them is REDCap. However, the library is not open. The only way you can access the library is if your institution has a REDCap membership, and you can access it through your REDCap account. The other a place where we see form-based evolution, and this has changed quite a bit over the last couple of years, is the NIH Common Data Element Repository. In the early days, the form-based elements of these were fairly minimal, but they have expanded it significantly to try and not only provide a way of collecting these forms, but also to enable all kinds of operations on this. So we are looking to still align with some of the efforts over here in terms of how do we move information back and forth. But we have learned through the various exercises that we have done that we need more than what's available in the schemas present here. So this brings us to kind of the 4 components of the ReproSchema project. And I'll go over each one of them So I'll start with the ReproSchema. This is kind of the core thing that defines what the data model is. And we look at it as a graph model that encodes information about data collection protocols and activities. A protocol is like an experimental protocol or a study, and activities are individual assessments that you might use in a study. The schema uses linked data principles to provide persistent URLs for everything that's encoded in the schema. It provides a way to track provenance, and the key goal of the schema is not so that we can kind of go after we've collected data and harmonize it to some submission standard, but to get data in as structured a format as early as possible so that the harmonization becomes automatic. Alongside the data model itself, it also provides a validation schema that allows us to validate data collected using various elements of the schema, or validate pieces that are constructed using elements of the schema. Okay, so moving on, I'll go counterclockwise to the ReproSchema library. This is an open collection of clinical and behavioral assessments. These are form-based assessments, together with a collection of questions around demographics or items around demographics, which are fairly common across various projects to ask. We manage the library through a GitHub project to track versions and releases. And we provide a mechanism to create your own protocols and activities first. And if you then think that this might be a good thing to contribute back to the ReproSchema library, you can move over some of the activities to the library. Just a note for those of you who have followed us for a while, we used to store protocols in the ReproSchema library. For the moment, we've kind of removed protocols, and we're kind of leaving protocols up to each individual site, study, project to maintain, while the library itself focuses on the most reusable items, which are the assessments and activities. We have a set of tools in Python and JavaScript to help you do certain things. These might be to validate various ReproSchema elements. It might help you convert between different kinds of representations. For example, if you have an assessment in REDCap and you wanted to bring it over to the schema, you should be able to do it with one of the JavaScript tools we have. You can also convert the various representations of schema across each other, and because of a nature of these schemas being represented as graphs, you can apply various linked data formats to convert things from one to the other. And then we've developed a prototype UI to allow us to kind of test out elements of the schema as we build it. And this is based on a Vue.js interface, and it uses the ReproSchema to basically provide a data collection interface in the way you would fill up online forms. It is a purely client-side application to preserve privacy. None of the data that's collected by it leaves your client or your computer without permission. And in fact, the permission has to be two-way. It has to be both you providing permission as well as the server that could receive this data accepting the data you're sending it. But it does allow a server-side backend to collect data. So what can you do now? Well, you can use the library. It has a bunch of different assessments. You could also convert REDCap activities or submit new ones to this library. You can use multilingual assessments. And this is, I think, one of the biggest shortcomings of most form collection protocols out there, or form representations. There is a need to provide different languages for various reasons, whether somebody's collecting data in English versus Spanish for bilingual context, or if you're collecting data in different countries around the planet, you might want to provide something that allows you to quickly switch between these languages. And I'll show you later that ReproSchema makes it very easy to add different language representations to the forms. So not only can you use existing multilingual assessments, we are not experts in every language on the planet. We welcome people to extend language support to existing assessments. So if you're looking to use the patient health questionnaire in a country for which we don't have a linguistic representation, you can include that quite easily by augmenting the schema that we have. You can create your own version data collection protocol on your own GitHub repo. What we provide is a set of tools and infrastructure and knowledge and know-how on how to do this, but you can run with this on your own without interacting with us necessarily. We would love to know what you're doing, but you don't have to be able to use this on your for your own self. And finally, once you have all this set up, at least for various simple use cases, you can collect data using a browser or a computer, or a tablet or a smartphone. For more complex cases, you can use things like MindLogger and RedCap to do more systematic clinical management studies that we don't support through our user interface. So who's using the schema? So one of our core partners was the Child Mind Institute. As part of the Healthy Brain Network study, they have been using the ReproSchema behind their MindLogger platform. And they've been creating different kinds of applets for different studies that people are using to collect data. Excuse me. The MindLogger applet allows different kinds of activities or protocols to be run for individuals or their caregivers. So it could be a child-parent interaction, or it could be a patient-caregiver interaction. And MindLogger provides a very comprehensive interface to try and tackle these types of protocols through smartphone-based data collection. We have been using it in some of our own work. We have at present COVID-19 based voice protocol where we're using the ReproSchema and ReproSchema UI to collect data. And then Remy, who's on this call at this point in time, has been using it for something quite different. So the COBIDAS, which is a Committee on Best Practices in Data Analysis Standards, I may have gotten that completely wrong, it came up with a set of recommendations of how to report the appropriate information related to different stages of an imaging experiment. And this requires different kinds of things, some of which at this point has to be entered manually. So Remy took the schema, took the requirements that came from a structured format, and was able to create an online platform for people to enter this information and collect this for themselves. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit into what I call a technical dive into various pieces of the schema. And some parts of it are going to go into a little bit of the details of the techniques. I'm going to try and relate it back to the kind of the conceptual framework as often as I can, but I'm happy to take questions on some of those things later on. And while I have it in this order, where we will go through the schema, the validator, the formats, the infrastructure, and kind of thoughts on versioning and persistence that we have implemented, there is no perfect order to this. I've chosen a order that allows me to kind of talk through different components in a somewhat logical manner, but because these things are intricately connected, one could almost start from any one of these other points and go through it. But we'll take it as it has. So first, I want to just get everybody oriented to the terminology we are using. And I'm going to start with this listing of terminology where we have a hierarchical structure of protocols, activities, fields, and response options, and kind of walk through it a little visually. So a protocol, for example, could be a sequence of assessments that you might do. It might be a screening process, a consent process, some assessments about voice, health, anxiety, or others. And that's what we represent as a protocol. It's a collection of activities where each activity could be something like that patient health questionnaire form. And within each activity, you have questions, and we call those fields in the schema. And each field may have different answers or possibilities for answers to it, and we call this response option. So in this particular questionnaire, the PHQ-9, the response options are the same for every single question except the 10th one. And alongside kind of describing how to represent the assessment itself, we also have a way of representing the responses to such an assessment. So response activity is a collection of responses, and each response then stores the link between the response to that question and the value that was created. And we'll go into the details of this. I just wanted to use this as a way of orienting you to the structure of the schema and making sure that you understood that each aspect of this structure has a model representation that we use. So this brings me to kind of a little bit of the technical. Every type of object that we have in the schema is represented as a class, and it has a set of properties. Now, I'll point out on the right that one of the things I did not discuss in the previous case is that an activity itself can be part of another activity. So it allows for nesting of activities as well. But in general, the schema consists of these 12 different classes at this point, many of which are fairly straightforward, but the key classes that you have to pay attention to are the protocol, the activity, the field, and the response options. On our website, you will find all the properties that go along with each of these classes or objects. I'm not going to go into detail, and I'm not going to ask you to read any of this on the screen. It's just that there is a place where you can look up all the properties and what they mean on the documentation for the schema. And each of these things, the classes and the properties, come with a URI, which will be consistent throughout the ReproSchema effort. So you can always consider that you'll be able to refer to objects through these URIs consistently as you continue to use the schema. So alongside the schema comes a validator. And you might be representing things like protocols, activities, fields, response options, and responses using the schema. And what you do, at least for when you create an assessment schema, you write using JSON LD. And I'll get to what JSON LD is in a second. And it's intended to simplify human consumption or human interaction with the schema. However, it corresponds to a valid RDF graph, and I'll explain this in a second as well, for machine interaction and query, and allows us to connect these pieces together. We use shackle shapes for validation, and this allows us to validate kind of structure of graphs. And you can use the shackle playground for a simple example. I won't go into this now. And we have released a version for our current release candidate of the schema that you can use to validate any document, any data document that you create using the schema. And there are various validation tools. There's a generic PyShackle library, which is generally useful for any kind of shackle validation. We have a slightly more specific ReproSchema library that allows us to validate any document against a specific version of a ReproSchema. And in the future, we expect to also release a JSON schema. Because it's a JSON document, you should be able to validate against a JSON schema as well. So let's go into these two formats a little bit. So I'm showing two over here. We use both of these in our schema, JSON LD and Turtle. And I wanted to use this time to kind of explain some of the elements that are really exactly the same between the two, so that you get a flavor for what it is. So if you focus on the left, which is a JSON document, as all JSON documents are, they have keys and values. And the values themselves could be structured objects, which themselves have keys and values or lists. Now, the key pieces that make this JSON LD over JSON are a couple of specific keywords. As you can see, one of them has been highlighted at ID, which tells us that the rest of the properties or rest of the keys in this document or in this subsection of the document are referring to properties of this ID'd document. So on the left, one of the IDs is example.org/Bob, and we are talking about properties of Bob. We say Bob is a person, Bob has a given name, Robert, Bob has a family name, Junior, Bob has a birthday, the death date, and an address. And within the address, we're giving it another ID. We're saying this is Bob's address, and Bob's address has a street address of 1600 Amphitheater Parkway. Bob lived at Google, obviously, from 1971 to 1968 at some point in time, and had a postal code 9404. On the right, we see this other representation, which is exactly the same equivalent information represented, but using a different format called turtle. We look at the ID, x:"Bob, and in turtle, that x: prefix turns into, as is shown on the top row, http://example.org/ns#. And so it still expands out to the same thing that you see on the ID on the left, but it provides a slightly more compact way of representing things. We could have represented this in a slightly more compact way also in JSON-LD, but this is meant to illustrate that both the turtle and the JSON-LD form are both representing exactly the same information in this way. And if you get used to one of them, you get used to the other one. So let's take this a little further. And I'll go back and forth between these two slides a little bit. So all I'm doing is changing the name of the prefix on top on the right column from schema to SDO. And the main point of this is that changing that prefix does not change anything about the structure, because I'm not actually changing what that prefix points to. It's still the same structure. And that's something important to remember, is that in both cases, these keys and these prefixes map onto something either in the @context section for JSON-LD or in the @prefix section for a turtle file. But as I said, they're both graphs. So this is an example of expanding this out as a graph representation. So now you can see again that x:Bob is of type person, has a given name Robert, has a family name Junior, has a birth date and a death date and an address, and the address itself is an object, so it has an identifier, x:"Bob's address, and it has properties associated with that address. So this is what allows us to both treat the information as a JSON document on one hand, but while simultaneously treating it as a graph from another perspective. And this is what allows us to represent something like the patient health questionnaire in the schema to a rich representation of connected information as a graph. And here's just a snapshot of this questionnaire through the JSON-LD playground, where once you get this document, you'll be able to click on and play with different pieces of this. So now I'm going to go through one type of JSON document, the protocol document. Actually, this is an activity document. And go through a few of the components that makes our schema kind of unique. As you can see in the preamble section, we are able to represent two different languages. So if you wanted to add a third language or a fourth language or a fifth language, you would simply extend the preamble with those languages. We allow the possibility of doing computation to compute certain things. So for example, for the PHQ-9 total score over here, we allow for a JavaScript expression to compute that total score on the basis of all the individual scores of the items. And each of the keys on the red are specific to the ReproSchema schema, whereas the other items are part of schema.org. So we are simply aligning with various elements that are already present in schema.org and extending them with information that we need for representing something like the patient health care query assessment in the schema. And as I mentioned, you can represent different languages in the preamble. If you were using our UI, you would just be able to switch automatically between one of those languages to the other language, and the entire interface would translate over from one language to the other language. So this allows for very quick collection of information, especially across participants who may speak one or the other language without having to construct separate schemas, separate protocols, separate assessments. It's all part of one, and it provides a consistent way of representing these language elements across assessments. So moving on to a bit more of that protocol, you represent different orderings of items that you ask through the order keyword, but you can add a few pieces of information around it through additional properties. So I'm going to take a few examples over here. So you can see the is about and add property slash item slash PHQ9_1, which is the same that you see in order. And what we are saying is that for that particular item, which is the first question of the PHQ9, we'll add a few more properties to it. Here's a variable name, here's the value required, and we have this other way of saying, and this is information that comes under the UI section of the protocol. So this is informing the UI, whoever is delivering the UI, look, we want to have some control over what gets delivered or visualized when. So isVis is a JavaScript expression or evaluates to a JavaScript value that tells the UI whether that particular item should be visualized or not. So in the first case, it simply says this is true, so it should be shown. In the second example I'm showing over here, which is the 10th question, isVis is computed by asking if any of the responses to the 9 questions were non-zero. And if it is, then that 10th question is shown. Finally, the total score is something that was computed, and we saw the compute logic earlier, but is never shown to the user. But if somebody does want to come in and say, I want to see the total score, they could come here and turn that isVis to true, and it would display the total score as part of the assessment. So this is just saying that this 10th question is asked if a problem was checked off as being positive, and this isVis allows us to represent that conditional logic together with a computation within the schema. So now you have the schema side of things. Our UI allows us to collect data and preserve that as well. And here we are using, again, linked data and graph principles to represent the information, again, as JSON LD, which is easy for people to process through various tools, but it contains a set of information that links back the information that's collected to what it was collected from. So in this particular case, I've highlighted that it says I've used a particular schema, protocol, etc., that was in a GitHub repo somewhere. Now, this is not ideal because I'm referring to master, but I can easily switch this from master to something else, and we'll see that in the next slide. It also says which language the person did this activity in, and it captures the start and end time of doing this activity. It also captures what UI was used and what version of the UI was used to, excuse me, capture this activity. In terms of the response, because of the way the UI works, we can attribute to a particular person. Here I use my name directly, but you can easily provide it a unique identifier which will anonymize this as to what's collected. But what's important over here is the next section, which is that it tells me that this response has these values 4, 5, and 6, which happen to be checkboxes on a list of things, but points to a very specific clinical history item that the response is about. So you get the complete connection between the response value as to the exact items and protocols and activities that the response is linked to. So the infrastructure of the ReproSchema project is organized around a few GitHub libraries. The ReproSchema itself contains the context and the validation information around the schema. The ReproSchema library is the public assessment library. The ReproSchema UI is the user interface for data collection. The ReproSchema Py is a Python library for validation and conversion. And a demo protocol which you can kind of copy over and tune to your needs to support your own data collection. In addition, there's one more repo, which is currently in my group's GitHub organization. It's called the voice backend, but we'll soon transfer it to be the ReproSchema backend, which provides an API service. So you will need to run this on a server somewhere to receive data from the UI, but it's kind of connected to the UI itself. So what does this look like? So on the client side, you have a person and they could be using a computer, a laptop, or a smartphone, and they open a browser to launch the ReproSchema UI. And all of those pieces are on the client side. The UI itself pulls in information from GitHub, so the study protocols, the ReproSchema context, and the ReproSchema library are all served through GitHub. And that gets pulled over by the UI again to the client side, where the client can fill in the data and either save it on the computer where they're filling in the data, or if authorized by both the client and the server to receive it in a lab or an institution or in the cloud, the voice backend allows receiving the data in the structured form that I showed. On the GitHub side, you can have user or organization repositories anywhere, and each of them can deploy this client-based collection via continuous integration to GitHub pages. So you don't need to set up your server at all to set up a protocol or a study collection. You may need a server if you wanted to send the data to that server. And all of these pieces are tested via continuous integration using the ReproSchema Pi library. The ReproSchema and ReproSchema library itself is accessed via GitHub's HTTP server. And because we are using JSON LD, it maintains relations via relative paths across the items, activities, and protocols. So it's a very linked way on the web to relate to very specific elements of either the library or the schema that allows you to create a consistent study protocol and that you can then use to collect data on the client side with it. So while many things have been done, there are several limitations and challenges. The library currently has only 57 assessments. Yes, many of them are on mental health, but that's not the whole world of assessments that are out there. You cannot easily search for across the items and activities yet. However, since it's a graph, we can add it to ReproLake or other graph DB. You'll hear about ReproLake next month, and maybe by that time, we'll have search capabilities via ReproLake on this graph. There is no complex UI-based builder yet. This requires some significant effort, but there's a simple version that exists in MindLogger. So if you create a schema using the MindLogger platform, you'll be able to add it to ReproSchema over here. Conversion from other formats may require custom code. So we have a converter that takes a kind of a standard modern REDCap data dictionary and can convert it to a schema. But if you customize it, we would have to do something to be able to convert it. The simplest form of a simple schema is to create a Google spreadsheet or an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV file and in a certain structure, and just use a JavaScript converter and soon to becoming a Python converter to convert it to the schema. But there are other challenges away from these technical things. How do you trust the curation? And that's going to be a community effort. We expect the community to come together and validate these elements. If they spot an error, refine it. But being an open public library as people use it, its version, you can track it, you know what version you used, and we can track if changes are made to these elements. From a scientific perspective, how does each item, activity, and protocol connect to a clinical, psychological, or psychiatric space? This is exactly the way linked data was supposed to operate. If you use something, you should be able to know how it connects to something, and that's the body of enclosing knowledge. And this is some of the other work that TR&D1 and TR&D2 are doing in the ReproNim project in describing various data elements that link to cognitive test disorders and other things. There's also extensive work being done by Arno Klein at the Childmind Institute to create a mental health database, which will have richer connections between all of these things as well. What processes are being studied? I don't know the answer to it for every single schema that we have, but this is where we want the community to kind of increase the knowledge base around these schemas. What we do is provide a way to add that knowledge base into the schema. Similarly, what claims are being related to these and connections to other ontologies. We can't scour every possible ontology out there, but as people come in, they can connect up these pieces as necessary. And that's what the world of graph-based schemas provides. So how can you help? Well, you can curate the library. You can fix, refine, validate existing assessments. You can add new assessments. You can add more languages. You can try it out. You can create your own protocol, and we are here to help, but we would love to see how you create your own protocol through instructions we give you. You can improve the converters so that other forms of structured information, whether from the NIH CDE server or from other older REDCap instances, can be converted. You can improve the UI. You can add more widgets to it. The UI provides some basic collection facilities, which is good for a lot of use cases, but not for every single use case. But you could extend this. More generally, you can contribute to related open source projects like MindLogger and Loris to not only use the schema better, but to support different components of the schema and to improve the UIs associated with it. So to summarize, what we have created is a schema where each item, a question, an activity, a questionnaire, or a protocol, a set of questionnaires, provides unique and persistent identifiers. This is important. This is missing today. Some of it comes from the efforts of the NDA, but that's kind of shoehorning what you did in your lab into something to fit a data submission protocol, rather than starting from something that gives you data collection from the get-go to be consistent. We provide an open and extensible library of curated assessments. We've done some curation, we'll continue to do curation, but we hope that the community will come together in helping us curate and collect these things. Versions of a given questionnaire can be tracked. So for example, we do have the PHQ-8 where the 9th question, which is about suicidal ideation, is dropped. But this is a custom derivative of the patient health questionnaire 9. And you can see that in the way the information is encoded in the schema. We allow for support and track internationalization. The ABCD study, for example, requires Spanish and English forms. And they created a fairly complex REDCap schema with some custom elements to support this. This information did not get translated well into the submission into the NDA schema. By creating, again, a core structure that represents multilingual information cleanly and consistently, we can support internationalization of various forms. As you have seen, protocols, activities, and items are connected using a linked data approach, which means they can be queried using graph databases. But it also creates the ability to add contextual information to a questionnaire at any level, whether at the level of the questionnaire or at the level of each item, or even down to the choices that people are making in terms of responses. The schema focuses on information, not implementation, although we provide a UI that allows us to ourselves prototype different elements of the schema and use it for lightweight collection. Our focus for the ReproNim project was on representing the information. And hopefully I've shown a little bit of how we can do that with the schema. With that, I'll stop and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Satra. I see the chat already has a question from Yarek, and if you want to take that on how many of those 57 existing Repro schemas are supported in MindLogger UI. And while you take that, other people can either type or unmute themselves.
So two things. There was a previous version of this where all of them would have been importable easily. We just released release candidate 1, and they're in the process of updating MindLogger to support release candidate 1. Once that happens, you should be able to pull in those 57. But part of MindLogger's effort is not just that it can pull in the schema, it's about improving how a given question or element can be represented as well. So they've done some extensive work around iconography, images that could be attached to elements. And in the 57 schemas that we have currently, they're kind of traditional question-based things. So they could be pulled in, but you won't get the aesthetic improvements that they have created for their own new protocols and activities.
Great. And we'll continue with the question and answering, but as we're coming up close to the 3 o'clock hour, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us and to remind you that next month, September 4th is our next meeting, and we'll have Jeff and the Repro Lake and the Sparkle, querying upon the Repro Lake and Repro Ponds. So any other questions out there from you all?
Thanks, Satra. This is JB. I just wonder what MindLogger is actually doing. Can you not actually update your schema to get the iconography as well? I mean, basically, can't those two things have one schema that they share?
They do share the same schema. So maybe I did not answer that properly. So MindLogger is using the schema. I'm saying the information about the iconography that they have added for their specific protocols and activities does not exist across all 57 of the things that we have.
Right, but if it does exist, it doesn't matter. Like, you know,
if they exist, they can submit. It's the same schema, so they can submit it to the library.
Right. Okay. Thanks. That was great.
Venture a question? No. Great.
Hi, this is Dorian Postina. Great approach, actually. I realize this is more for the organization of the work at the beginning during data collection. I'm interested, though, in understanding a little more if there is any vision how the data should be kept and organized for distribution to other entities. And in particular, if there is any idea of how this data could be integrated in the BIDS brain imaging data structure format.
Fantastic question. I'll answer it in a couple of pieces. So there's a ReproNim way of storing the data that's collected. Now, data collection means that people could use the schema, convert it to a platform of their choice like REDCap or MindLogger, and use their response structure. So if you have used REDCap before, it just creates a CSV file that you have to parse to do certain things. The thing that we are adding to that is that when you convert the schema back to REDCap, the column names map onto these items from ReproSchema library and hence maintain a link to these external things. So in the BIDS context, and this is work that's also ongoing with another collaborative project here with Dave Keeter, which is to augment BIDS data sets with extended ontological and other information. So you could convert the data to a BIDS TSV, but because we have the links to the items and the questionnaires, that could go into the associated JSON file to enrich how the information in the TSV gets directly linked to the things that were used to collect it. If you use our UI to collect data, then you get these JSON LD responses coming out, which itself forms a graph. And in the ReproNim world, we are calling that either a ReproPond or a ReproLake, the distinction between private and public stores of graphs. So you could store it temporarily as a graph, either on disk or in a database, and then export it out as a BIDS TSV with an associated JSON that's enriched and included in your BIDS data set. So there are a few paths through which the collected data could be used, but it partly depends on what instrument or what mechanism you use to collect the data. If you use ours, there's a cleaner connection, but I'm not going to force our UI on everybody else.
So that means, what would happen if you remove a subject or add a subject to the data set? That's a critical question for me.
Right.
And
so,
that's why I don't like that much the TSV style of BIDS itself. We're keeping things in JSON individual files for every subject.
Right. So I briefly showed one response thing where it has this structure called was attributed to, which says it belonged to this subject. So when you do the conversion, you can query for the subjects that you want or don't want and just export only the relevant people into the TSV.
Got it. So, but to update the graph itself would need a separate.
Right. So the graph, and one of the reasons we like a graph is there is no merge conflict in a graph. It just keeps adding. What you have to do is to change the query in terms of what subset you want to retrieve from it.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Satra, JB asks the questions about the hurdle for using, for creating a UI that would fill information into a DATS model. And please define DATS maybe for others.
So DATS is also a data model for describing data sets. And it involves, again, a set of mandatory, required, recommended, and optional properties that you can use to describe a data set. So this is where I would say at a basic level, you should be able to use the UI to get in some of those DATS element. However, DATS does have a couple of more complex objects, and for that you need to build new widgets. But it's really a matter of adding support for custom widgets. Since Remy is on this call, he has requested this for Kobidas as well. So at least some support will be coming for that soon, where you can enter a couple of different values in a single widget. And once that is there, perhaps people can extend it to provide more custom container objects for DATS. But it should be doable. And yes, if you did that, you would get all the benefits of graphs and connectedness out of it. And then it would just be a query transformation to DATS.
So I guess hearing no more questions, I will thank you once again, Satra, and thank all of you folks out there in listening land for joining us today. And hope you all stay safe and see you next month or somewhere else in the web. Thanks for joining.